Welcome to episode 31 of the Filmumentaries podcast. This is a bonus episode of sorts, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But firstly, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about Jonathan Rinzler, who passed away at the end of July 2021. Jonathan was a husband, a father, and to the many film fans around the world, a talented author of simply the best behind-the-scenes books. I first became aware of his work in the early 2000s and bought pretty much everything he wrote on the original trilogy Star Wars films. Outside of Lucasfilm, he also continued to write books on Alien, Aliens and Planet of the Apes. He most recently wrote Howard Kazanjian, A Producer's Life, which is due for release this September in the US, October I think in the UK. I contacted Jonathan last year inviting him to come on the podcast. He replied saying yes, and we arranged a date. And then I heard back from him nearer that date, saying he'd had some bad news about his health and would have to postpone slightly. Despite what was going on in his life, he still wanted to continue to do the interview. I, of course, said, "Don't worry, Jonathan, it's not a problem. You know, you take care of yourself. That's the priority." And he said, No, I do want to talk. And in some way, I think it helped him talk about his work. It helped sort of distract him from the day-to-day of the treatment that he was having for his pancreatic cancer. I'll always be grateful to Jonathan for his work, his time, and his generosity. It was really great to see his fans pull together to donate to his GoFundMe page to cover his medical bills. Within a day or two there, between us all, we raised $50,000. Any surplus was going to be donated to a charity of his family's choice. Sending my heartfelt condolences to all that knew Jonathan. He was a great guy, and we're the lucky ones. His legacy will live on in his wonderful writing. Thanks, Jonathan. Back to this episode, number 31. So when I finished speaking with Walter Murch for episode 30, he emailed me and asked if I was happy with what I got. I replied saying that I, of course, had many more questions for him, but I was aware of not wanting to take up too much of his time, adding that I'd regretted not talking to him about his directorial debut, Return to Oz. He quickly replied saying, "Let's chat again on Monday. I can give you about 45 minutes and I'll be happy to talk about Return to Oz." So that's exactly what we did. So here's the second part of my chat with film legend Walter Murch, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. Walter, can you put into context the position that Disney was in the early 1980s, and what led them to approach an outsider, as it were?
Disney had always been the most closed of studios. They were self-sufficient, rarely brought other filmmakers in, whereas, the other Hollywood studios would constantly be trading directors and actors and whatever. But I think in the late 70s, there were two shocks to the system at Disney, which was Star Wars and The Black Stallion, both of which were made by us up in San Francisco. And I imagine that there was a conference among the executives at Disney saying, these are the kind of films we should be making. And there had been a crisis when Disney himself died in 66, I think. And they had been running kind of on autopilot for the last 15 years. And so they started reaching out to other people, and somehow my name got into a basket and they plucked it up. And I was called down to talk to them about doing a project for Disney, which at the time was highly unlikely. So that was the general setup that resulted ultimately in me directing Return to Oz.
And what was your connection with the Oz film and the Oz books? Where's your first kind of experience with those?
My My mother had been born in what is now Sri Lanka, and her parents were Canadian, and they were there starting a teaching hospital in the northern part of what was then Ceylon. And the big thing for kids at that time, around the turn of the century, were the Oz books. It was exactly like Harry Potter is today. Every year there was a new Oz book, and you got the Oz book and waited for the next one. So that was her experience growing up. And when I was born, as soon as she thought I was able to take on the Oz sensibility, she started reading those books to me, and I loved them. And the Ozma of Oz, one of the books that Return to Oz is started on, was the first book that, I don't know, I think I was age 5 or something, that I sat down to, I'm going to read a grown-up book, meaning a book that had more words in it than pictures, although I loved the pictures. So that was the ground. The Oz sensibility was deeply ingrained in our family because of the history and in me. And at the same time, my son was born in '68, and we started watching Sesame Street in the early '70s. And there was something about the Muppets that made me think this is kind of Ozian, the quality. It helped that Frank Oz was one of the main puppeteers on it. So I went down to Disney to just be polite and have a meeting. And the executive, Tom Wilhite, said, well, what would you like to do that you think we would be interested in doing? And I plucked out the Oz books. So I said, a sequel to The Wizard of Oz. Oh, he said, we own the rights to all those books, which I had no idea. And the discussion started from there. And that copyright that they had bought, or the rights were going to run out in 5 years or something. So they were very anxious to get something going. And after that, one thing led to another. Gil Dennis and I wrote a treatment, and they approved that. And then they asked us to write the screenplay, which we did. And, there was the usual back and forth, but not very much. And then it was greenlit. Gary Kurtz, the producer of Star Wars, was producing, and that gave them some security blanket feeling. And we would be shooting in the UK, in London, at Elstree Studios, where Star Wars and Indiana, anything that made them feel more comfortable about hiring a sound designer editor to make this multi-million-dollar film. All of those things helped to get the film to the point that we started shooting.
And you clearly decided on a different approach. I mean, I see it not so much as a sequel, but a kind of alternative universe kind of version of The Wizard of Oz. Was there ever a suggestion from Disney about it being a musical?
No.
No.
No, that the musical, especially in the late 70s, early 80s, there had been a number of failures of big musicals, and what it takes for a industry to do musicals is a whole infrastructure of sensibilities that the 60s had kind of pushed that away. Mm. And so I wasn't confident, I'd never directed a feature film before, and I wasn't confident about directing a musical film. But the other thing to remember is that there's the 1939 film with all of the kind of vaudevillian qualities of that era. And then there were the books, and those are two separate universes. So what I wanted to do was to make a film like the books, in a sense, to make Oz as if we were making the Black Stallion, to base it in reality. This is a real shipwreck. This is a real island, rather than painted sets. And so that was the decision, and there was no, can't you do this, can't you do that kind of thing. They were nervous about the whole opening that we had written with the electrotherapy stuff. But they thought, well, if we're going to hire people from outside Disney, we want to give them their ability to do what they want. So there was a brief period there where that sensibility was allowed to run free, so to speak.
And that electrotherapy part of the story, I guess, came from the research you would have done, about the turn of the century and this new kind of world that was evolving. So it kind of positions that film in its time and gives it a reality beyond what the original film did, I guess.
Yeah, no, very much. There was a lot of that stuff going on in 1900, which is when the film is set, just right around Halloween of 1899. And that whole Dr. Worley was a real person. He was based on one of these people. And I should mention that electrotherapy is not electroshock therapy. And in fact, we're coming now back around to that kind of thinking about how the brain works. And, it was early days in understanding that the brain had electricity in it. And so what they thought was that when you're confused, like Dorothy is, it's because your neurons are tangled like hair. And so what we're going to do is kind of run a comb through the tangles and smooth everything out. That was the concept behind it.
I think a lot of people kind of misremember that original movie as well. That I think even when I became a parent and my kids got to the age of 4 or 5, I thought, I'll show them Wizard of Oz, and I just gave it a quick watch, and I thought, wow, this is actually a lot darker than I remember. I think a lot of people remember, the skipping down the yellow brick road and the dog and the dress and the ruby slippers, but actually there's a lot of darkness in that movie. So what do you think it is that people have kind of misunderstood about your movie? Because although it kind of immediately subverts the iconography of Oz, it's not that much darker than the original movie. Maybe it is something to do with that setting, as you said before, where yours is based in more of a reality.
Yeah, I think it's also that it isn't a musical.
Yeah,
but
sure.
In a film that has, there's that little scene description of the film where it says, girl arrives in surreal landscape, kills somebody, and then forms an alliance with 3 strangers to kill again. So that's the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to Maurice Sendak, who at one point was going to do the production design on Return to Oz, and he said he was, whatever he was, 8 years old when he saw the Wizard of Oz, and it completely terrified him. It was one of the foundational experiences of his life, was watching how scary the Wizard of Oz was in 1939 when it was made. But it's relieved by the music. You can have these scary things, but then when people start singing, what you're saying is, it's not real. This is just a premise to entertain you. Whereas I think, well, first of all, I should say that I wanted the film to be scary, like fairy tales are scary.
Yeah.
So I was very surprised when people were really frightened by the film, because there's no blood, nobody touches anybody to do them harm. I mean, hands come out to threaten you, but there's no, the closest anyone comes to real peril is Jack Pumpkinhead being swallowed by the Gnome King.
Yeah.
Which is, the other thing I think which is big is that in The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy was Judy Garland, who was 16. And in Return to Oz, Fairuza Balk was 9, which is the real age that Dorothy was, because I wanted to make it like the book. And seeing a 9-year-old in danger is different than seeing a 16-year-old playing a 9-year-old, which is obviously fantasy. But the real 9-year-old, you think, what's going to happen? Especially if you're an 8-year-old watching this. So I think there's that element.
She's very convincing as well, Fairuza Balk. I mean,
absolutely.
You're right with her, because you can feel like her sort of depression in the beginning and her desperation to kind of prove that she did have this experience, and then throughout the film, you shoot these wonderful reactions of her kind of experiencing the world around her, and I think that separates it from the Judy Garland experience, where at any moment, as you say, it's a bit kind of, oh golly, kind of, aren't we having a gay old time, let's sing a song. That never happens. Yeah.
And for much of the film, she's the only human being on screen.
This is true. Yeah.
She's surrounded by claymation and puppets.
Mm-hmm.
Tick-Tock and Jack and Bellina and Dorothy. Whereas in the Judy Garland film, she's got Ray Bolger and Bert Lahr. Their other grown-ups are friendly with her, whereas Dorothy is alone with creatures. But she's a fantastic actress. I would say, after a day of shooting, driving back home, I would say, she's not a child, she's a grown-up from the land of children. Meaning her absolute command of what it takes to act in a film, and, obviously being able to memorize all the dialogue and not making any mistakes, and knowing where to look for the camera, and Fairuza, we're going to do a pickup shot from 2 weeks ago when you're talking to Tick-Tock. Oh yeah, and she knew exactly where she was looking 2 weeks earlier, even though we were not shooting it with Tick-Tock now. So and that was repeated over and over again. And in between takes, she would disappear, and I'd say, Fairuza, where are you? I'm up here. And she'd climbed up the scaffolding on the set, the lighting scaffold, and was talking to the lighting guys way up top, and she treated the whole experience like a playground, like a vast jungle gym. And that was true from the moment we started preliminary tests with her. And she was just very, very comfortable in that environment with everybody. And that told me it's going to be tough, but she will survive this experience.
Yeah, I watched this morning, found the making of the little half an hour kind of, it's semi-promotional, of course,
right.
But it has some little inserts of interviews with her, and she does come across as a very, very confident kid, very kind of savvy. Yeah. Timing is clearly an important part of a film's success and how it fits into the culture of the time. If I look back to 1985, there was, I guess, the two big successes in terms of family movies back then were Back to the Future and The Goonies. Right. Now, both contain violence, guns, kidnap, terrorists.
Right.
So what is it about Return to Oz that made it more scary to kids and unacceptable to parents? Do you think we kind of covered this, I guess, but do you think it's something to do with that rose-tinted memory of the original and parents going, I had a wonderful time seeing it when I was a kid, I'll take my kids to see this sequel, and then their expectations were kind of dashed?
Yeah, Wizard of Oz would play every Easter. Okay, it's going to play again. Let's all watch The Wizard of Oz. So it was like a member of the family. And so even though it had scary things in it, they were not scary anymore because of the repeated viewings. It turns out all right in the end, whereas when you watch Return to Oz for the first time, you don't know how it's going to end. And so it is scary. And it has there are no musical numbers. There's music, but no singing. Another thing I think that put parents on ill at ease about the film is that Aunt Em abandons Dorothy at the clinic.
Mm.
And there's a movie convention, especially among where parents are pictured, especially the mother figure who, in that version of the film, Aunt Em would be walking away from the building and then she'd stop and she'd say, "There's something funny about that place. I don't know what it is," and so she'd go back. But she doesn't. It's real in that sense. She leaves and Dorothy is there. And so the film says to kids, it says, sometimes your parents, although they're meaning well, will put you in a dangerous situation. So you've got to look out for yourself and form friendships, unlikely friendships, with whoever you can grab, the Ozmas and the TikToks and the Jack Pumpkinheads and the Bellinas to help you. And so that's a kind of an undercurrent message that's present in the Oz books. The Oz books, Aunt Em and Uncle Henry are not the Aunt Em and Uncle Henry of the 1939 movie. So that's another element, I think, that goes on.
Yeah, I wonder if one day it'll be rediscovered as a kind of feminist film in a way, because you've got this strong female protagonist that's kind of doing it on her own. All right, she's being assisted by her friends, but she's certainly got a good head on her shoulders and isn't relying on any man to come and rescue her.
Yeah, I mean, another element is that films for kids that star people like Dorothy are not immediate magnets for kids to go and see. The Cuarón's film, The Little Princess, suffered the same fate because girls will go see it, but boys won't go see it because it's a girl film. Whereas if it was The Goonies, it was a bunch of boys, the boys will go see it, and the girls will go along with the boys to see it because they go along. Mm-hmm. So that's another element there in the film's reception.
Yeah, I think that's part of Western culture, isn't it? Because if you look at the films of Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli, I mean, there are so many girls in those films, and they're hugely, hugely popular by my girls and my family as well. I have to be honest here and say that I saw the film in 1986, I think it would have been, and it did scare me and my sister. Right. And I watched it again for the second time last night. And actually, I'd seen bits of it over the years when it was on TV, and I was actually quite surprised at how visually stunning it is.
Yeah.
I mean, was it Salisbury you shot in, I think, wasn't it? And there's some stunning landscapes, and then look at some of the sets that you had at Elstree there, like the kind of mirrored palace and everything. Some wonderful atmospheric stuff there. What are you most proud of about the film?
I can't slice and dice it.
Yeah, you are proud of the film, though.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, a thing. It went through 3 successive Disney executive boards. It was started by one group. They were replaced just before we started shooting. We shot with that group, and then they were replaced when the film was in late post-production. So by the time the film was being promoted, it was 2 generations old as far as studio executives were concerned. And, they didn't promote it correctly. It was a difficult film to promote because of everything we've been talking about. You had to figure out how to pitch it, and they didn't. But they didn't care about the film because that's old stuff. And so they actually let me alone pretty much in the post-production of the film. They didn't come and say, do this, do this, do this, because they'd already written the film off in a sense.
Mm-hmm. And if you now had the chance to kind of go back and recut, do you think there was anything that you left out or anything that you included that you would have taken out?
No,
No.
Not fundamentally. There at the time of this first shift that I was talking about, a new executive came in as head of Disney, and they basically said, "What is this film?" And they decided the budget, we can't make this film for that much money, so we had to cut a lot before shooting. And Gary Kurtz was fired, although not on paper. He was promoted to executive poobah, whatever, but
Mm-hmm.
he basically had very little to do with the film from that point on during shooting and in post-production. And they appointed Paul Maslansky, who was not a producer so much as he was an executive watching out for the studio's interest on the film. But so I didn't have, there was no really powerful person on my side in the making of the film, because Gary was not around and Paul was not that person.
Mm.
I remember when he arrived in London, we invited him over for dinner at our house. And, it was a nice dinner, and we talked about jazz. He was a jazz aficionado. And he said, I'm not going to have dinner with you again because I don't want to be your friend on this film. That's not, that's not my role on this film. So you think, okay, what's this going to be like? And it was rough because of that. But I did rewrite the script, and I cut out about 15 pages. And there was a whole other bunch of characters called the Army of Oz, which was in the book. And there were 6 generals and 1 soldier, and the soldier was Tick-Tock. So I made the decision to amputate that arm. It I think would have been interesting to have them in the film. It would have been some adult presence around Dorothy, even though they were pictured as incompetents. Wilfred Bramble was going to be one of them, and we were going to have fun with them. But it just was one of those decisions that it got made. I made it, and it allowed the film to get made because it really significantly cut the time and the budget of the film.
When you were kind of going through those difficulties, and I think you said before, briefly fired for a moment or two there, did you go and seek the counsel of George and Francis and your other contemporaries?
Yeah, George flew over. When I was fired, George flew over from Japan. He was having a conference with Kurosawa about something, and at his own expense, flew to London and convinced Richard Berger, who was the executive who fired me, to rehire me because nobody was going to take this film on. By firing Walter, you've essentially killed the film. And he became a sponsor of the film, and he said, everything will be fine from now on, but if it isn't, I will step in and do something. And at that, to have George Lucas say that made them all calm down. And I spent 6 days in outer Mongolia, having been fired, and then I came back. The film never stopped shooting. I was talking to Mike Kitchens, who was an associate producer, and he and the A camera man kept things ticking over, in case I was rehired, which in fact did happen.
I was of course looking up some things about the reviews at the time as well, and there was that famous Siskel and Ebert kind of segment where they tore the film to pieces.
Right.
And they talk about how this is not an upbeat kids film, and then you think the original, right. She's in a tornado, she can't get home, she kills a witch,
right.
And the positive things about that film are the relationships with the other characters in the same way that it is in your film. And I was talking to my wife, I wondered if, given today's kind of landscape of how film news breaks with Twitter and Facebook and social media, I wonder if the film today would have found its audience, rather because then you were relying on word of mouth a lot more, right. From obviously you have these key figures, Siskel and Ebert, and then that kind of proliferates across the industry.
Right.
Not necessarily a question for you, Walter, but I just wondered. It feels like maybe it was a film that people weren't quite ready for at the time.
Yeah, I think all you have to do is speed ahead 10 years to Nightmare Before Christmas, which has a Jack Pumpkinhead character in it, and all of Tim Burton's sensibility is kind of, you can sort of see a continuity there, but in 1985 that hadn't hit yet.
Yeah, I was thinking about Coraline. Yeah,
Henry Selick, the director of that, was one of the storyboard artists in development on Return to Oz.
Oh, really? Yeah. Interesting guy, Selick, yeah. So how were you perceived by Hollywood after the reaction of Return to Oz, and how did that inform your next project?
Well, in 3 words, probably, how dare he make a sequel to The Wizard of Oz and make it like this? People probably felt the idea of making a sequel was a bad idea in the first place, and then to make one that scares children who run screaming out of the theater it's like, I had committed a crime, so I was banished. And, I had a number of other directing projects that I wanted to take on, and nothing ever happened. It's whether the term for that is you go to jail, Hollywood jail, and that's where I was. And so I couldn't stay in jail, really, because I had a family to support, so I went back to editing.
And what was the next project, do you remember?
Unbearable Lightness of Being.
So that was 88, yeah. Well, 88 release.
Yeah, we started, it came out in early 88, but we started filming in 86.
And you've directed a couple of other things since then, but not features. I mean, there was the Clone Wars episode, there was the Captain EO stuff that you did. What lessons learned on Oz did you bring to those, do you think?
Well, I directed a musical number for Captain EO, a second unit, with Michael Jackson. I'm one of the 2 people on Earth who directed Michael Jackson in a 3D 70mm movie, Francis Coppola being the other. Yes, I did a Clone Wars episode just to keep things ticking over. I was in between projects, and George Lucas said, "Why don't you do this? It might be interesting." And it's a half-hour animated episode of this ongoing series, The Clone Wars. So that was fascinating because, directing animation, especially for somebody who'd never done it before, is a big learning experience. And they were also breaking in new developmental software on that, which is a a kind of training wheels version of Maya. And I was given it and told, go ahead, do something. So I blocked out some scenes in it and then set the locations, and here are the characters, and they're doing this, and this is the camera is here, no, it's over here, and that kind of stuff. So it's such a different animal that from directing actors on sets in live action that I wouldn't want to compare it. You just use your cinematic sensibility of, when do you want to use a wide shot? When do you want to do a close-up? Whose point of view is this? What would make the greatest impact here? Do people understand the story here? All that kind of stuff.
Mm. And are you able to talk briefly about any of the other directing projects that you wanted to get off the ground, or are they kind of buried in Hollywood history?
Their history. One of them was a kind of serious mummy movie set in Egypt, about an archaeologist who goes off the deep end and believes that he is the reincarnation of the person. Is he really, or is it schizophrenia? That kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other project was sort of a twin biography of Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison.
Mm.
And a sort of Mozart Salieri, but inverted.
Mm-hmm.
So those were the two projects that I had on the boil.
Yeah, that's the thing with Hollywood, isn't it? There's so many projects that kind of disappear for whatever reason. And it's just a shame that the circumstances of Return to Oz have kind of happened and prevented you from doing that. But I think you've used that sort of cooking analogy in your book before about sound design, where it's best to use fresh ingredients and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And I think Oz does appear to have all of the ingredients, the right ingredients, for a great family movie. It's as if the oven wasn't working or something. The oven being the sort of zeitgeist of the time. People just weren't ready for it, maybe.
Yeah, and an element in there is, there's two things. It's worth remembering that despite my love for the Oz books, they were banned from libraries in America because it was about witches and wizards, and therefore it was unchristian. And so there was a lot of middle America against the Oz books, not so much the movie. The movie somehow got under the radar, although it was not a big success when it first came out. Its success only happened
Is that right?
after it started running on television and people got familiar with it. So there was, and that's still there, that's that kind of sensibility is metastasized into Trumpism now, but it's present. And if the executives who greenlit Return to Oz had stayed in power and had given the film the correct launch, kind of warning people about what kind of movie it was, but you're going to love it. Because I was making the film not only for kids, but for grown-ups who had grown up on The Wizard of Oz, and who might be interested in seeing this other, as you put it, this other planet in the Oz solar system. But that didn't happen. The executives, Eisner and Katzenberg, were 2 generations removed, and their ad campaign basically said, avoid this movie. So,
I did see one TV spot on YouTube that was like, it was all very jolly, like, here's TikTok, he's a mechanical man, and
Right.
it was all a bit kind of jolly, which is not the tone of the film that I'd just watched.
Think, the original executives had asked Drew Struzan to do a poster, and he did that great poster of turn of the century women heads featuring Mombi.
Mm-hmm.
And that says, something. That's a more accurate picture of what the movie is going to be than what wound up being.
Yeah, I was trying to find out what other territories it may have been received differently in, and I know that it had some success in other territories. And I read that one place in particular, Japan, it was fairly well received. But then again, it goes back to what we were talking about. People were ready for a female protagonist and that kind of visual imagination that the film had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, Latin America, Spain. Now, I think it had its roughest market in the United States because of the fact that the Wizard of Oz film is not just a film, it's a standard by which Americans sort of judge themselves. And many quotes from it are just part of ordinary language. Toto, I think we're not in Kansas anymore, or there's no place like home, or those lines are just, part of normal conversations. So it was risky. I mean, I knew it was risky to begin with, but it became even riskier because of the cultural shift. And also, I think, ironically, if it had come out in the 1970s or the 1990s, it would have. But the 80s was Morning in America. It was White Bread America. It was Ronald Reagan. It was Banish the Darkness. It was, except for certain kinds of darkness. But that's another factor in it, is that the zeitgeist had shifted by 1986 to a kind of Reagan America that is not so tolerant of these things.
Yeah, appreciate your time. Really do. It's been a pleasure.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed this bonus episode. Next up is Oscar-winning sound designer Gary Rydstrom and Oscar-winning writer and director John Patrick Shanley. Thanks to the new patrons on Patreon. If you can also contribute and help me continue to make this podcast, please do so at patreon.com/Jamie Benning. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.
What's happened to the scarecrow?
Come nearer to me. The Gnome King took the scarecrow and all the emeralds back to his mountain and turned everyone else to stone. You will be rather attractive. One day. Not at all beautiful, you understand, but you'll have a certain prettiness. Different from my other heads. I believe I'll lock you in the tower for a few years till your head is ready. And then I'll take it.
I believe you will